Next up, we have Andrei Hagiu, who is one of the leading scholars in platform economics and is here at MIT and affiliated with the Initiative on the Digital Economy. And we're also joined by Simon Rothman, one of the leading investors in sort of network businesses. And I think this is a really important perspective because we've heard a lot from the firms who are largely from traditional industries, but I think a lot of the innovation has also been fueled by this nexus of the investment community that really understands these business models. So please welcome Simon and Andrei.
Thanks, Sean. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I think we're expecting a fireplace. This is meant to be a fireplace chat somewhere. Simon and I have been having these kinds of talks together for a few years now. I think we've done a number of them. We basically, the interest that we share in common is obviously platforms and marketplaces. I'm an academic. I've always been fascinated with marketplace businesses. Simon is the most knowledgeable and insightful person that I know, practitioner that I know on marketplaces. So I always enjoy having these. In order not to give the audience the impression that they're cutting in a conversation that started a long time ago, what we want to do is get to some very interesting cutting-edge marketplace questions. But before we get there, sort of warm ourselves up. Maybe just quick recap of why we like marketplaces and what are some of the pitfalls. So I thought the best way to do it would be top 3 reasons everyone should be a marketplace or should think about a marketplace business, and top 3 reasons why you shouldn't want to do it.
Oh wow. Okay.
So game show host style.
Okay, so I'll see if I get these right, the top 3. So I will actually start by asserting that marketplaces or networks or maybe even broadly platforms, two-sided platforms where you don't own the assets or the people, is probably the best business model ever created. I'll put that out there. It is, and the reasons I like it, the 3, and I'm biased, okay? I'm very, very biased in these. One is they're very, very durable. So if you look at businesses, typically as they get bigger, they tend to get weaker. They do. That tends to be, if you look at the Fortune 500, I think there's only one company that was part of the, no, not Fortune 500, it's the S&P 500. I think there's only one of them that's actually part of the original, it's GE. The rest have turned over, and the half-life of them is actually shortening. But what you're finding with network businesses, they're much, much more durable, right? They last a long time. So durable, and they get stronger over time. They tend to be very high growth. When they work, they compound. So if you look at Facebook, Airbnb, Uber, as they work faster, and they actually will have exponential growth for a period of time until they actually will plateau, which is highly unusual. And the last one is they tend to have really, really high margins because you don't own the people, you don't own the assets. Airbnb doesn't own the hotel, they don't own the rooms, Uber doesn't own the vehicles, eBay didn't own the products. None of it, the traditional kind of dynamics you normally have, the economic dynamics, are kind of inverted. So high growth, compounding exponential growth, high margins structurally because no ownership, and defensibility that is not typical, kind of defies normal business gravity. And those 3, when it works. Now, the downside, the biggest downside, and frankly it's number 1, 2, and 3, is the fact that they're almost impossible to build. The good news is they're equally as hard to kill. They stay around much, much longer. Look at Craigslist, which, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't talk about it.
You should look at Craigslist today, for example.
Craigslist today is so anachronistic, it looks as if it were built 20 years ago, which it was, and it hasn't evolved. It may be the biggest, worst experience on the internet. They don't have an app, let's be clear. They don't have, but what Craigslist is a testament to the durability of marketplaces and platforms. Right. But they are really, really, really hard to build. Only a decade actually get built. And there are thousands and thousands we see, but they're very hard to build.
Right. And actually many companies have tried to kill Craigslist with better technology and superior experience, but
liquidity is stronger than user experience. The power of a network is so much stronger than any individual. Everyone, by the way, every clone I've seen of Craigslist is actually better than Craigslist. Yeah. And there have been thousands of them. but liquidity kind of trumps that.
I always think, I hope they stay around for a while so we can always have that example, the best pure example of the true power of network effects. It's clearly not the quality of the products. I just hope they stay around for a little bit.
And by the way, let's be clear, the team, I don't know how big the team is, they're very secretive and they're very private. I think there's a couple dozen people. And the rumor is the listing volume on there it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And they personally pull out, they only charge for 2 categories and only professionals, not individuals. It's free for like 90+%. And the thing spits out high hundreds of millions of dollars a year in cash.
All right, so this is the sort of the ground level, like why we like marketplaces, also cautionary tale, why they're very hard to build. So let's get into the sort of the topics that we like to talk about a lot, at least the very recent ones. So the first one has to do with this notion that one of the reasons we like marketplaces is that it's very low touch, low control. If it works beautifully in the sense you're orchestrating buyers and sellers to come together without actually having to do much. Yes, you have to do governance, but you don't really have to take control. Now, the issue is in practice, it's not that simple. So the fact that you can say, well, I don't have control, therefore I have very low cost is great and may make sense from a business standpoint. The reality is in a lot of cases, the constituents, so let's say the users, so buyers and sellers or other constituents, may actually hold you responsible for much more than you control. So even though in theory you can say, well, look, I'm just a platform, I don't control this. If something goes wrong, well, there's a very serious attribution problem. Is it I don't know if it's say Craigslist or eBay, is it the seller's fault or is it eBay's fault? And it's something, I think we should have some perspective on like how do marketplaces think about this issue?
So there's a couple of factors you have to think about. So on one end is if you control everything, kind of a traditional company, you own the inventory, you own the people, you control the service, the expectation is that the quality should be high. You're very deeply integrated. And it has been. The problem is that business model is very heavy. They grow slowly, they have low margins, and when they get big, they become disruptible, right? But that's one end. The other end is kind of the early generation of the marketplaces, which was, I'd say, V1 of the marketplaces as the internet came around, which would be eBay and Craigslist. And they were very open platforms and you're hands-off, right? Very laissez-faire, where people did the listing, they created the metadata, the images, the writing, they did the sales, they created the terms, the pricing, everything. The thing is, we live in an era, and that was fine, and that worked well when the internet was young and the consumers were new, and that was still better, right? Going on and having broad selection was better than the alternative. If you wanted collectibles, going one place that had 1 million of them was a lot better than going to, trying to go to 1 million collectible and swap meets and shop. So that was good enough. The problem is we live in an era now where marketplaces tend to be intermediated. And you're in the middle zone. You're no longer completely hands-off, nor are you own everything. You're somewhere in between. This is kind of like, think about Uber and Airbnb, right? The 2 examples most people in the room probably know about. Uber actually tries to have a customer service that looks as if it controls everything. However, it wants the economics and leverage and scale of something that doesn't control anything, right? So the vehicles aren't theirs, the drivers aren't theirs, but they do a lot of matching. You don't have selection. In that zone there, and Airbnb is in the middle as well, but slightly closer to eBay. But they're both in the middle. The challenge is a customer, if you're at Airbnb and you have a bad experience, who do you blame? Whose fault is it? Ultimately, we've had these discussions. There is whose legal faults and there is whose practical faults, right? And the perception. The reality is they are arm's length. If you read the terms of service, the TOS, it will state clearly this is not, it's not Airbnb's. They don't kind of hold taxes, or maybe now they're going to start to. But for most legal reasons and for purposes, it's not Airbnb's fault. However, when something bad happens, Airbnb gets blamed. There was a situation probably 4 years ago. We've been investors, full disclosure. We invested in Airbnb 6 years ago, 7 years ago in the early days. Probably around 4 years ago, maybe 5, there's something that people nicknamed ransack gates. A woman actually had a very, very bad experience, and it was a bad experience, very bad, and she wrote about it. It almost killed the company. Like, the company was on the edge because no one cared that it technically was not the company's fault. They lost the confidence, and the one thing that's important about marketplaces is you don't broker a product or service. It sounds like it. It sounds like Airbnb actually brokers rooms, and Uber brokers rides, and eBay brokers used goods. What you really do is you broker trust, right? That's the currency is not cash, it's trust. The currency is not products or service, it's trust. And when you violate that, you bear the brunt, the weight of that consequence, regardless of the legal, what's technically wrong. And so that's the challenge you have with these. You want all the economics of influencing, but the customers have all the expectations of control, and you live in this zone, that tension between.
So I think this is like worth emphasizing these 2 points, right? The first one is, I mean, a lot of entrepreneurs, I mean, anyone that wants to build a platform, exactly, you want the cake and I want to eat it too, right? So
sure, why not? I do too.
I think I've shown this graph, right? At some point we had this graph which have like control and cost. Yeah. So I want the highest degree of control with none of the cost. Well, that's not going to happen. So people, like all these companies are trying to sort of arbitrage it somewhere in the middle, like minimize cost while maximizing control, until you hit a roadblock like this. And it's interesting, so the other point that you said, which I think is worth emphasizing as well, you can say, okay, let's say I have a bad experience on Airbnb or eBay, and it's very clear, it's traceable to like a very specific failure that's in the contract. So the buyer may say, sure, it's because the seller failed to do X. But another interpretation, I can always interpret it, maybe they failed to do X, but at the end of the day, it's eBay's fault because they didn't screen that buyer out. So no matter actually what happens legally, it can always be perceived as a breach of trust.
That's right. And once you breach the trust, the marketplace unwinds. Everyone keeps talking about, and I believe it as well, that the durability of marketplaces is that they're almost impossible to kill, which is true. If you want to kill a marketplace, you don't compete against it. You let it, hurt its own trust. And we're seeing some case studies play out in real time with Uber and others. That marketplace is deep and broad and powerful from a business standpoint. But if you look at it from a trust standpoint, questions have been raised. And I'd always said this, like, Uber, to kill Uber before its natural death, which will probably be multiple generations, and I think most marketplaces will live out, like Craigslist, will live longer than they should. The only way you kill them is if they kill themselves. And sometimes they shoot themselves in the foot, in the hip, in the leg. You got to wait, occasionally one of them will shoot themselves in the head. And I think the question right now is, we're watching this play out, Craigslist has not shot itself in the head, but it shoots itself in the foot regularly. And the question here is, when we see Uber, I don't know how bad is bad, but it will be interesting. I've never seen anything like this. It will be powerful to see.
So I just actually an interesting implication of this, which I think should be particularly relevant for this audience, or say for companies that are not born as marketplaces or platforms, but maybe have an established business, and they're trying to transform that business into a platform. So we heard earlier from Deutsche Bank, trying to create platform offshoots. So this notion about control versus responsibility is even more salient. The reason is the following. If you start as a pure marketplace, at least, so you're aware of these issues, at least you get to set the rules from day one and try to sort of educate your users. This is where my responsibility ends. So this is where my responsibilities, and this is where the responsibility of the seller is. So, I mean, yeah, there are problems, but at least you can define it from the get-go. If you have an established business, a traditional business, product or service business, and let's say all of a sudden you say, well, I just heard about marketplaces from Simon, I would love to build a marketplace offshoot. The issue is, no matter how much you try to communicate, your customers are still going to view you as the main provider. So you're going to be inherently more responsible, perceived as more responsible than someone that starts as a marketplace from scratch. So I'd say this is probably, and I've had this experience like working with some large companies, trying to move from pure product to pure platform, and trying to tell their customers, we're no longer just a product company, we're a platform for third parties. Well, their customers say, sure, but I'm primarily your customer first, so therefore I expect a very high level of, of responsibility or of certification for any third parties that you bring on board. So this whole idea, I think, is like even more relevant if you don't start as a marketplace and you're trying to move in that direction.
The other question, and I've always thought of this because you have these conversations of companies say, listen, instead of someone else disrupting us with the business, because it's kind of unfair. I'll set the stage and I'll highlight it, but there is some challenges. So the issue is, imagine Airbnb as a case study versus the hotel industry, right? The hotel industry for a century has viewed as an asset legally on the balance sheet as an asset, but also the perception that their locations and physical infrastructure is an asset. It is an asset. Well, the era we live in now, that asset actually should sit on the other side of the balance sheet. It actually is a liability. You grow slower, you have lower margins. It is actually an anchor. It's like it's ankle weights. It slows you down, where for the past century, it was the thing that was defensibility. I have the right location off the highway. Like I have this infrastructure. I have a consistent experience. It was my strength. The problem is it's not your strength now, right? It actually becomes a form of weakness. And so the challenge is pretty profound. And the idea that when you talk about it, the idea of being able to go from that and just layer on or just kind of create an Airbnb doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is not you don't have resources or you don't know the industry. Of course you do, much, much, much better than someone who graduated art school 2 years earlier. Like you clearly know. The problem is it's a value system issue, and it's how you view things. For example, when you run a marketplace, it has more in common with an ecosystem or a system generally than it actually has to do with a product or service. The idea is not to tell someone what to do, is to create structural incentives so they will do what's right for them given the rules that are in place for everybody, right?
So psychologists have this term called enabling behavior. I think the idea is I don't fully control, but I will enable, I'm trying to enable other people to do it.
So here's the trick. I need to influence you, everyone here, to do exactly what I want by you doing what we've incented you to do for you. That it inverts, all the decision making is so different than control. When you control something, you say, you will do this, here's how you do it, here's why you're gonna do it, or else you're fired, or else I won't stock my shelves with your stuff, or else I won't give you, pay you more, whatever. I won't give you more business. That does not work. And so the reason existing companies have a hard time doing it is the mindset is completely unique. Everything else is the same, but how you get there is different. And so it's not what you do, because everyone knows, oh, I'll get someone to rent a place. That's pretty obvious. But how do you have a consistent experience without owning or employing them, and do it in a way en masse in hundreds of countries and in thousands and millions of places? That's the magic. And if you can do that, I think industries will be able to disrupt themselves, but you have to kind of do it uniquely.
All right, so that's the internal. So there's the external challenges that we talked about, but there's also the internal organizational shift.
It's hard.
So let's do one more topic, and then maybe we can open it up for a few questions. The other topic that I think it's interesting today, just looking at the marketplace or platform space. There's some marketplaces that are very broad in scope. So say eBay or others cover many product or service categories, and others that are vertically focused. Obviously, there's lots of them being built. There's a lot of turnover. How do we think about some sort of equilibrium or steady state? Or maybe the more practical question would be, for an entrepreneur or a company that tries to build a marketplace, under what condition does it make sense to be a vertical specialist, or under what conditions should you actually try to go for horizontal? Yeah.
Well, I mean, marketplaces initially started horizontal because, if you go back to the birth of the internet, there just was no competition. So it was open field, and you just kind of built it. And some of them made sense to build that way. And so I joined one that was a single category, eBay, early on, and it was just collectibles. And then we added thousands of categories in hundreds of countries. But today, what you're seeing, the migration is towards laissez-faire, open marketplaces that were broad. And what's happened over time, over the course of the last 10 years, 20 years, is that the marketplaces have become intermediated. So they're not open, but they're not fully managed. They're intermediated, and they started to verticalize, right? Part of this is in a world that there's a lot of competition, you have horizontal plays, it's easier to start and stay kind of in a lane. So there's easier point of entry and management. And I think that's part of the reason you've seen more of them. But the real reason, and you and I have talked a lot about this, is the real reason to do it. That's the competitive landscape that it's a little bit easier. But the real reason to do it is when a broad platform, remember, you have to have system rules. We've talked about things that are systematic. You can't have a broad platform that every single vertical has completely unique rules. New pricing, new user experience, new different profile, like you just can't do it. That defeats the purpose. It's not a platform, right? It's not singular. So if your requirements are unique enough that they do not fit comfortably within a consistent set of rules, you should consider kind of a vertical. For example, like we were talking about earlier, that say high ASP used goods, $10,000 watches, right? Jewelry. The idea that you need extreme vetting, the kind of vetting that you are 100% certain, if you're going to spend $10,000 on a platform, you need to know it's not, it's as described, it's not fraudulent, and that you will get it. So that kind of marketplace, you may want it sent to you. The platform actually will verify it. The platform may actually fix, clean, like certify it. So doing that, you can't do for a typical platform, but for a vertical, you can. So that's one. So when the requirements for buying or selling or matching or some core function is so unique, I think that makes sense. And you haven't seen many, but you're going to see some, right? And so you'll see a few more of those as well.
Yeah, so I would think, I mean, that's a nice way of putting it. It's probably, it has to be somewhat idiosyncratic that it actually pays to specialize in that. And the second one, what's interesting is, I mean, I've had conversations with a couple marketplaces like this. So I think about it, there are marketplaces that just focus on the search cost part, so they just enable buyers to find sellers, and they don't do anything for a transaction, like say Craigslist, right? Craigslist in no way helps you with the transaction. You have to pay cash, and it does absolutely nothing. It's just literally a directory, just search. If you're going to be vertical, it better be that you have a lot of stuff to add in the transaction after the search is completed. So to your point, like certification, vetting, I mean, you have to be able to go deep enough and add value in the transaction in order for that to be sustainable. Otherwise, if it's just search, it might as well be as broad as possible. You actually, like, it pays to be broad.
And I think the other thing you'll find, and this is true in all businesses, and it's equally true in kind of platforms and marketplaces, the more value you put into the transaction or the service, the more you can actually extract, right? And so these other things, so there's a thinness to ones that actually do the search piece. And we live in an era that is so competitive that thinness isn't sustainable. So I think in the past, the case would have been you just make lower rents, you just make less money per unit effort, per listing, per unit, per hour. You'd make less. I would actually argue today it's an issue of viability, not just that thinness you won't survive. You see most of the platforms today tend to add a lot more value, which part of the reason they're getting intermediated. And so you can't look and clone something that's 10 years old anymore. Those businesses would not survive today. And the ones that are still around because of that are around because the network effects are so strong they've survived, but that same business couldn't be built today. Craigslist could not be built today at all the way it is. It just would not, it just wouldn't work today. But given its legacy and its network effects, it can also not be killed today, right? So it's this weird state of limbo that feels bizarre, but
people might say zombie, but
it was not a zombie. It's actually,
but it creates
it's
value.
Making
Yeah,
a ton of money. Like may I have invest in a lot of zombies that look like that? That'd be fine by me.
So I think we actually have time for one or two questions.
Yeah, so we can pause here.
So this morning we had a bit of a debate over whether or not Netflix is a platform or not, and platforms have become a hot topic, so I'm sure you have lots and lots of companies coming to you saying that they're platforms. So do you have like a checklist? What is your screening process for determining whether or not you're willing to sit down with them?
So let's distinguish two different terms. So I will call things a marketplace or a transaction-based network, not a platform. And let me tell you the difference. In my world, where I look at that, my definition is super clear. It's a very bright line. There's no ambiguity. Do you own the asset or the people providing the product or service? Netflix owns at great expense that content, right? They're buying that content. That for me is a service provider. That is not, now it has platform dynamics, absolutely. But it is not a marketplace. It is not a transaction-based network, and it is not, by the strictest definition, a platform by the way I define a platform.
I mean, it comes back to what we talked about at the beginning. It's control, right? I mean,
They
if you
own
don't
it. They
control,
pick it. They pick what they're going to buy. They
pick
actually
the prices, the everything.
everything.
Yeah.
They control the whole thing. The fact that it's distributed digitally and not in a physical doesn't change anything. It's the same.
And by the way,
business.
control can be actually disaggregated from the actual inventory. So you can have some, like say Walmart, you can have pretty much full control, but without really truly owning all the inventory risk. So I think what really matters is what we care about is the control.
You own the people. You own the product. You're not a platform.
All right, so now we're in lightning round questions over there.
Hi, you mentioned the example of Airbnb and hotels and how physical assets of a hotel can now be a liability because it weighs them down. So in the example of e-commerce, eBay versus Walmart, Amazon, et cetera, how does a company like eBay kill Amazon, if at all possible, which of course feels like a stretch?
It feels like a search, although let me remind people, and if I sound a little bit sore about it, maybe I am. At one point, eBay was worth 3 times Amazon, maybe more when they were public companies. Because at the time, what happened, eBay doesn't own anything. The profit margins were whatever, 85% margins. Amazon was losing money and famously still losing money. But I actually think the challenge is I don't believe they can compete against themselves head-to-head anymore. And let's assume they both had equal strength, and they don't. I mean, Amazon is amazing today. It really is amazing. But Amazon essentially is a primary goods retailer. It is the Walmart of this generation. It is, right? It takes, the current technology and does it, and it's building more physical infrastructure. It's pushing, DCs, these distribution centers closer to cities. It's driving the SLA. It started out as next week, then it went to this week, then went to tomorrow, then went to today. And Amazon Prime now is moving to next hour. I'll buy, so any item in the head, like the popular items, not long tail, but the head, you'll be able to get within an hour. That is redefining the service level expectations of retail and of primary goods. Now, Amazon does have a marketplace. It is not their core business at all. Amazon would thrive just fine without it. And I think those skills, the physical infrastructure, the retailing capability, the ability to control, and that is a completely different set of skills and goals of eBay. And at one point, I think Amazon had eBay envy. I think there's been points where eBay has had Amazon envy. At the end of the day, they're just primary and secondary goods versus controlling and being a retail and the other one being a marketplace. They kind of feel to me like they're pretty distinct, in my view. Now, they may view it differently, but I would be hard-pressed to imagine them being able to compete head-to-head.
Last question.
Okay. Would you consider a marketplace like Opendoor as a platform if you don't consider Netflix being a platform?
That is more interesting. So I don't know if everyone knows what Opendoor is. So Opendoor essentially is creating like a wholesale distribution channel for individual homeowners. For example, you have a home, you want to sell it. Instead of putting it on the market, Opendoor will buy it from you. And very quickly, because you don't want that sitting on your balance sheet, we'll securitize it and take it off the balance sheet and get rid of it. It is not a marketplace by my definition. Now, it is doing the best thing it can, which is it buys it and takes principal risk, which for me is anathema to kind of what I personally like. But you can build huge companies doing it. I'm just saying that's not a typical marketplace. But very quickly, as soon as they can, they will resell it, securitize, and get it off. So it is trying to lighten the load of their balance sheet, but everything takes a round trip through their balance sheet before it goes off. And as they get bigger, that balance sheet will get heavier. It's going to be a complex, heavy model. And you do have that risk. The reason the principal risk is worrisome is if you buy wrong or if the market takes a turn, it's your problem. And those are things that, given the high ASP, the value of the homes, it's a kind of business that can grow very quickly, but it's also the kind of business in the wrong, perfectly wrong circumstance can have a perfect storm. It could die very quickly. There was an analog of a company that did that for cars called BP. It grew very, very quickly, and it died. And it raised a lot of capital in the process, and it also took principal risk. It would essentially buy the car from you and then try to resell it. It's tricky, tricky model. But by the way, I hope it works. I think there's room for business to do that. It's just not a typical marketplace.
Let's take one more.
So I'm getting the okay sign, so I guess I'm
Yeah.
okay to go. So I'm Veronica. I'm a director of strategy at Philips. And one of the problems that we have is one of these mature sort of traditional companies, is how do we assess these new opportunities? So when you have a limited investment, how do you decide which of the ideas that have the most potential? And clearly it's a new area for us. So I'm really curious as a VC investor, how do you, if you had 100 points that you had to assign to a company, what you look at when you decide to invest in them, what would you assign those points to?
When I look to invest in company, I am very biased and skewed because I look for a certain business model. So let's be clear, most
Marketplace
investors will look for
Yeah.
raw upside.
Yeah.
My thing is I've already filtered, and I believe the biggest companies that can be built will look like these companies, will look like Airbnb, will look like eBay, Uber. So I already have filtered, I'm making, a very, very distinct bet. Within that, though, looking at a couple factors. So if it's super early stage versus not, like once it starts working, even early, if you know what you're looking for, is not that hard to tell. It's really not. Now, it may be hard to get an investment, but it's not that hard. So the trick is, how can you identify before that stage? Mm-hmm. And I look for a few factors for the market, right? Hold aside the entrepreneur. You want someone who's exceptional, who's an outlier in ability. But you look here, fragmented industries, high sustained margins in many industries for kind of reasons that are more legacy, and like you talked about the real estate, 6% to sell a house that's 10 million as well as 10,000 is crazy. I don't even understand how that makes it makes no sense. That should be the market, if it were efficient, and it's not for other reasons in that space, which we can talk about, has sustained high rents that are just unrealistic and unfair. So fragmented supply and demand base, rents that seem very high, very complex supply chains with multiple steps. If I see something as 3, 4-step supply chain, that is destined, technology is very good at information and lowering a lot of kind of coordination costs. Technology can strip that out. I made an investment in a company recently called Convoy, which is a trucking marketplace, $1 trillion space, huge fragmentation. The average truck fleet size is, I think, 4 trucks, essentially a mom and pop business. The rents brokers will make 20, 30% for brokering it. It is a broken industry. So I look for big and broken and structurally big and broken in ways that technology is very good at fixing. And technology doesn't do everything well. It actually doesn't do lots of things well, but it does those things very, very well. So that's what I tend to look at.
Thank you.
Okay, great session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.